Perez's unbelievably badly executed Dutch Grand Prix started very well, but a series of terrible mistakes ruined his day and sparked rumours whether or not he deserves the Red Bull seat in the future. While so far we were giving him chances, it is perhaps time to get real and think about this maybe being his ceiling skill-wise. Red Bull as a team didn't help him as well and made a decision that, while controversial, was justified. But it begs the question, should they have done so? During the Dutch Grand Prix, Red Bull's racing tactics drew attention, especially in their handling of drivers. Although there were murmurs about Max Verstappen being favoured over Sergio Perez, it's worth noting that Perez wisely switched to intermediate tyres as it began to rain, which momentarily put him at the front. Yet when dry tyres became necessary, Red Bull decided to pit Verstappen, who was then in second place, before Perez. This undercut approach by Red Bull resulted in Verstappen taking the lead. After passing Pierre Gasly's Alpine and Zhou Guanyu's Alfa Romeo, Verstappen quickly caught up to Perez. But when the time came to switch back to slicks, Red Bull chose to pit Verstappen first. When Perez made his pit stop on the following lap, he found himself trailing Verstappen. As he rejoined the race, a baffled Perez asked over the team radio, wondering aloud if Max had indeed performed an undercut. This raises the question, was this a strategic oversight that disadvantaged Perez, or did he simply not have an optimal race performance? The race threw into sharp relief Verstappen's superior prowess in wet conditions. It was almost bewildering to see him close the gap on Perez with such swiftness on wet tyres, gaining an incredible 4 seconds over a solitary lap. Wet races are the ultimate crucible for gauging a driver's skill. As opposed to simply relying on speed, it necessitates a perfect harmony between the driver and their machine. One slight misstep can easily send the car careening off the track. The differences between the two drivers stood out vividly during those initial laps on the intermediates. Verstappen was the epitome of precision and concentration, executing each maneuver flawlessly, while Perez grappled with not only preserving his lead, but also overtaking competitors. It's a testament to Verstappen's superior capabilities in such conditions. Even with a switch of vehicles, it's my belief that Verstappen would still eclipse Perez under wet circumstances. The race presented an intriguing scenario, with Verstappen remarkably closing the distance on Perez in such a short time, especially on those wet tyres, outstripping him by a full 4 seconds in just one lap. Indeed, wet conditions tend to spotlight the chasms in skill levels between drivers, and Verstappen and Perez already have an evident disparity in their prowess. Driving in the wet isn't solely about raw speed, but rather the intimate connection and understanding a driver has with their car. A fleeting lapse in judgment in these conditions can result in the car skidding off course almost instantaneously. As such, the contrast between drivers becomes glaringly apparent in the wet. During the early stages of the race on intermediates, Verstappen was on point, displaying a clear game plan and executing it perfectly. In contrast, Perez was wrestling with trying to consolidate his lead while also dodging competing racers. Given these observations, I'm inclined to believe that even if their cars were swapped, Verstappen would still hold a distinct advantage over Perez in damp conditions. The gap between Perez and Max Verstappen is evident, especially when considering a 4-second loss in the RB19 and errors like colliding with the pit lane wall. Initially, it seemed as if these were just typical mistakes on Perez's part, but there comes a moment when one has to acknowledge that Chico Perez might not be on par with Verstappen. The latter seems to have the capability to outperform him on any given circuit. Moreover, Perez's skills in wet conditions, although decent by F1 metrics, have never been extraordinary. Banking on him to shine in such weather could be dicey, given that some drivers naturally find it more demanding. What I found very odd, however, was Horner's claim that the decision to pit Verstappen ahead of Perez stemmed from fears of Albon and Alonso potentially undercutting Max. For anyone familiar with Formula One, this justification seems a bit far-fetched given the situation. The way Verstappen, cut through the traffic was quite sensational, Horner said after the race, when the race's Mark Hughes asked him about the decision. Chico had the target to pull the gap on the cars behind him, but Max's pace as he came through the field was such that at one point he took 7 seconds out of him over 3 laps and was coming very fast. Then you get to that awkward point at the crossover, and Fernando Alonso and Pierre Gasly behind him had pulled the trigger after to switch to slicks. You could see from Albon on slicks that the circuit was coming alive for the slicks. So had we pitted Chico first, they would have both undercut Max, so we'd have gone from a net 1-2 to a net 1-4. So we pitted Max first, with the risk that he'd undercut Chico, but we'd end up as a team first and second. It was a no-brainer. If roles were reversed, it's hard to believe that the team would have justified their decisions in the same way. Imagining Perez consistently outperforming Verstappen by a 4-second margin seems rather improbable. Hypothetically speaking, had Verstappen been in the lead with Perez, Alonso and Gasly on his heels, Red Bull most likely would have called Verstappen into the pits first. Alonso's potential to snatch the lead was clear, evidenced by his performance against the Red Bull drivers later in the race. Despite this, Verstappen's speed superiority means he'd have had ample opportunities to regain his position during the race. It's almost comical to think that Red Bull would fear Williams or Aston Martin, teams that realistically pose little threat to Verstappen's dominance in his Red Bull car. The notion that these teams could threaten Verstappen's lead is almost laughable. If Perez had maintained his lead for an extended duration, given Red Bull's potential early transition to slicks, it's clear that Verstappen remained the probable champion for that race. The concept of merit can indeed become ambiguous in such situations. Red Bull's agenda is unambiguous. They want to clinch every victory and every title, with Verstappen being their primary asset in this mission. The team's strategy-centric decisions further underscore this. Horner's emphasis on Verstappen's impressive feat of cutting down a 13-second lead to merely 4 in just 3 laps post the transition to intermediates speaks volumes of the latter's prowess. Perez's justification for his languid pace, grounded in his anticipation of a more prolonged rainfall and thus preserving his tyres, does raise eyebrows. Given that most other teams conveyed predictions of only a transient spell of rain to their drivers, with some even choosing to persevere on slicks, the decision seems all the more peculiar. Although a later rain did materialise, it appears Perez's team may have been overly cautious or perhaps misinformed. Perez and his fans certainly have grounds for disappointment, as his savvy call to pit on the initial lap, a move he led, produced positive results. Some might contend that this move rightfully earned him the lead driver position, yet his claim that he could have maintained the lead longer with better weather insights simply doesn't hold up, especially considering Verstappen's typical advantage in similar conditions. While Perez might have retained the lead for an extended period, and an earlier call for slicks from Red Bull could have assisted this, Verstappen was poised to be the definitive Red Bull victor in that race. The concept of deserving seems doubtful in this context. Red Bull's objective is clear: win every race and every title, and Verstappen is their primary asset to achieve that. It was merely another instance showcasing Red Bull's strategic priorities during races, and who can fault them when there are moments when one driver consistently outperforms the other by a significant margin. Whether or not Perez will be in a Red Bull car next year is anyone's guess. We can see doubts from Marco starting to surface, and while Horner is still adamant in keeping Perez for 2024, should the Mexican continue like this, I do believe he and Marco will have a conversation about him soon enough. But let's wait and see how this one develops. What do you think? Did Red Bull really show favoritism by pitting Max before Chico, or is it expected of them to do that, seeing the gigantic skill difference between the two drivers? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.